Hey there. I'm going to start this over because we had a little technical difficulty, at least on one end. Welcome, good evening to the channel. I'm Steve Hoy with my co-host Kim Rabluski, coming to you from Brownsburg, Indiana. We're here to talk everything about Moto, all years, makes, and models, from beginner rider to hardcore rider, which would be that guy. Comments, feedback, questions are welcome. Please subscribe. Let us know if you can hear us. We think we're live now. I see some viewers popping on. Shout out to Performance Power Distribution in Brownsburg, Indiana. Performance Power Sports for all your sprockets, chains, and off-road needs. That is a free ad right there.
Yeah, and just a shout out to them again. Even if you have a bike you think is obscure, they're probably going to be able to help you because they're able to find what you're looking for.
Shout out to Shopcat.
Yeah, shout out to my buddy. I miss him terribly, but there he is. We're reconnecting after a couple of years of absence. Now that we're in the new shop, he doesn't want to live there with us. He likes it better here for some reason, but I'm glad to be able to come here and visit him. Thank you, Joseph. Loud and clear, he says. Great. Thanks. All right. Well, for today's discussion, last week we just kind of did a backstory on both of us. Now we're going to get right at it. Are you a new rider? If you have any questions or comments, you can type those in the message bar. We may or may not get to those in the live channel, but we'll keep those for future use. We've got a few people on now. How many of you are new riders, if any, out there? Yeah, and if you are, we'd like to give you the opportunity to ask what you'd like to talk about. We can go there, but it's kind of important to what you have to say. Yeah, so we talk about this all the time in the shop. And in the shop, we work with a lot of vintage motorcycles. And so a lot of times we will be talking in reference to a new person wanting a vintage motorcycle. That being, I mean, vintage is what, in the 90s now, right? Well, I looked it up. Didn't want to trust my own opinion of that. And most of the time, vintage is considered 30 years now with motorcycles are older. Okay. And one of the things that I also saw was that a person considering a vintage motorcycle, and this was from industry people, said that if you're going to buy a vintage motorcycle, which I thought was interesting, they would prefer that you consider bikes that were made in the 60s and 70s over bikes that were made in the 80s and 90s. Because I can see that. Their point was that a bike in the 60s and 70s will have more of the simplicity, a little bit easier to manage, they're maybe simpler, less expensive, yeah. They're simpler. But that bikes in the 80s and 90s are just used motorcycles. Well, and big problems. Also, 80s bikes have a lot more to them. You've got extra relays and components that can go wrong that are hard to diagnose. And if you are going to be a vintage motorcycle rider, not the rider itself, but with a vintage motorcycle, you're always going to be tinkering on those. Yeah, that's true. And you might want one, and there are a lot of people that do. And they are cool. And you look cool on them. The cool factor is very high. In fact, I did see one website that I thought was interesting. Somebody was suggesting that it should be your preference with a vintage motorcycle to buy a Brat bike or a Bobber or something like that, which I thought was interesting because they showed some cafe bikes that were, you know, by my standards and your standards were pretty hacked up, but they thought that was the cool factor. And they also made the comment that they thought you'd make money on it if you bought one of those. Oh, well, which I'm not sure I would agree with that no matter what, but there is an audience of people that finds those bikes particularly cool, and they buy them and they pay a lot of money for them. Yeah. So it'd be wrong to say that that's crazy because we've seen evidence of it, but just keep that in mind if you're thinking about a vintage bike. Yeah. Back to beginner motorcycles and someone that may want to get into riding. I think the first thing you want to talk about is how to learn how to ride. Me, when I'm talking to someone new, I suggest many times that they get a small dirt bike and go out and learn how to ride on the dirt a little bit, like a little TTR 125, go out to Badlands and get on some dirt and some gravel and some sand and learn a little bit of how to ride a motorcycle on dirt. Now, if you're going to back up and actually learn how to clutch and shift, I think that's a good motorcycle as well.
just going in a straight line, learning how to shift and ride. And I know you've taught some people how to ride on some of your smaller bikes. So what is a good bike to learn on, and what is a good starter bike to buy when you are a new motorcycle rider?
Yeah, I think you brought up a couple of really good points. And one of them is, with most motorcycles that we encounter, there is a manual clutch. There is a brake on the right side of the bike. There is a shifter on the left. And since 1975, the shift pattern has been consistent by federal law. It's down for first and up for the rest, with neutral in between first and second. And there's a purpose in that. It's to make sure that people don't get confused on which side of the motorcycle they're trying to get used to.
Right.
Your point about dirt bikes is correct, because it is much easier to learn at a slower speed on a smaller bike. And if you're off-road, you're not in traffic generally.
Yes.
And that means that you've got your own field to try to figure it out in. And if you're just learning how to do the controls, then that's a great place to do that.
Yeah. Another thing about that is, a dirt bike you can get a nice one for $800. And, if you fall off of it and you crash it, it's not really going to hurt it that much. Your street bike, you go out there, start crashing it around.
It gets pricey,
a little pricier
because it makes it ugly.
Yeah.
Dirt bikes you can buy, and they're already to some degree used a little bit, and maybe not as pretty as they might be,
right?
But they're going to be utilitarian, and that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that kind of bridges what we're talking about in terms of getting a grasp on how to ride the motorcycle versus how do you want to learn, motorcycle training courses are essential.
Yes.
I don't think it's always been that way, but they haven't always been available. But there's a lot of expertise being done in a consistent way for people to take basic rider courses. And if you haven't done that, even if you're a relatively seasoned rider, it might be worthwhile to consider doing it just to see what people think is urgently important.
Right. And one thing to note on that is around here, if you go to the abate course, I think is it still called abate, or have they changed the name of it?
Well, there's rider courses of all kinds.
Right.
And abate is one of them.
Abate will they will put you on one of their motorcycles, which is going to be like a Rebel or a Suzuki, GN 125 or 250 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's not your bike. So you actually have to, once you learn on that bike, then you've got to go home to your bike that you have your garage and kind of almost relearn all over again, at least the particulars of that, going from model to model.
Yeah.
Many things are the same, but.
Well, the controls are more than likely in the same place, unless you're going to get into a vintage bike that's older than 1975 that has some different characteristics and maybe comes from someplace other than Japan. And in those situations, even Japanese bikes had different shift patterns before that. So you can simplify your life by getting something post 1975, probably a little newer than you might think, because you'd rather learn your physical responsibilities and the riding aspect of it rather than figuring out how to fix it.
Yeah, that's one thing I was noting. If you separate the wanting a vintage bike or just wanting to ride a motorcycle, I would say many people I've suggested just getting something newer.
Yeah.
Morgan Mars is a good friend of ours and actually a customer of the shop, and he'll come in and ask some questions every now and then, and he's been through several bikes, so he kind of knows what he's doing. But he was asking for his wife because she expressed an interest in riding. And I mentioned to him, if money is not necessarily an object, I would want as new bike as possible where you can push button start and that thing's going to be mostly reliable. And he ended up looking up what's the CT95 or something, some C95 scooter looking new Honda bike. Do you remember what that was?
Not off the top of my head, no. But
someone will out there.
Also, in my research for this conversation, I also found that generally speaking, people that know the motorcycle industry recommend that if you're going to buy a motorcycle to learn on, your best bet is to buy something that's about 5 years old, because it'll be really modern, probably more reliable. It will have already depreciated. That way you haven't lost any money.
Yep.
You can learn on it. And if it's in good shape when you're done, you got really good odds to be
pretty
able
much
to
get your money back
and move on.
Yeah.
That's probably great advice rather than going out and investing a lot of money in something that's not going to fit you very well.
Yeah, Nick, I'm trying to think of what the new, how you have the new monkey bikes the new monkey bike, and you got your Grom, and then you have there's a little scooter. I think it's a 125.
Yeah, you might be talking about the 125 step through that looks like a step through 50.
Right.
That's a real popular new bike, and a lot of people are buying them because they have a retro look.
Yeah, I think they're $2,500, $3,000 for brand new retro styled, easy to learn on.
Yeah, and they look like a motorcycle that Honda's built 100+ million of. So people like those.
What else here? We've got someone said something about not going out and learning on a Hayabusa. I think that was Randy Schwinn.
Yeah, it was Randy Schwinn, and that's a great point. It's not a good idea. One of the things I researched today was what are a list of reasons you should not be riding a motorcycle, and one of them was if you feel like getting your first bike means you've got to be on something like Randy's pointing out here, 100+ horsepower, 140 miles an hour. If that's your entry level criteria, you might want to rethink how you're doing that.
Yeah, it's the Super Cub C125. That's the new Super Cub.
Yeah, that's
Thank you, Randy.
Like a step through 50, but it's a 125.
Right.
Yeah. Is that diesel?
Is it 5K? That's a little pricier than I would want to buy one of those if Nick is right. Oh, yeah. Anyway, so when you're wanting to buy a new bike, what are some of the options out there? I always suggest a cruiser styled bike, especially if you're a little shorter in the inseam, whether you're a guy or a gal. A Rebel 250 was kind of the one to buy back in the day. And now if you want to go with a bigger CC, a Sportster is still a good option, right?
Sportsters
Harley
are
Sportster.
Outstanding options for a series of reasons. One of them is, and my wife has a Sportster, and it's not the first motorcycle she's ever ridden, but that was the one she wanted to get after many years of being away from it and coming back into it after taking a rider course. And a late model Sportster, Evo Sportster, is really inexpensive. You can buy a really nice one for under $3,000. You can ride it for a long time and turn around and sell it again for something close to what you paid for it, as long as it's in the shape it was when you got it. So they're easy to maintain. They're reliable.
Any size person can ride that bike.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's
because they have a very low seat height and a very low center of gravity. And I'm not a big fan of all the Harley Davidson lineup, but Sportsters are good bikes for people that A, don't ride a whole lot, and B, don't want to spend a lot of money, and C, might be a little nervous as a first rider because they want control of a motorcycle. Even though a Sportster still weighs 500 pounds, it's down low where you can manage it.
Right.
Yeah, not a bad idea.
Some other bikes that are out there are some adventure bikes. If someone's wanting to get into the adventure bike, I know that Diddy, Daniel, a good friend of ours, he bought the is it the 900 GS, the BMW. He found that was the shortest
I think it was an 800
inseam bike.
Yeah, and he's short of
adventure bike that you could get.
Yeah, and I love.
Now, they're a little pricey, but
they are, and they stay that way, and they're expensive to fix too. But in Daniel's case, he's somebody that's got a lot of riding experience, even though he might be inseam challenged, like some other people might be. And I got to say, depending upon which adventure bike you might be thinking of, one we had in the shop recently was a 950 Adventure KTM. And I didn't feel comfortable riding that bike because it was so tall and so big.
It was a tall bike.
It was demanding of the rider because of its size and power. Yeah, it's a 100 horsepower off-road bike that weighs 500 pounds. So, it's a cool thing and a cool idea, but I would recommend that you have a lot of experience before you get on something like that.
Right. Yeah. So we went through that style, fitment, reliability. Once you find a bike you want to ride, now what you've got to do is get to know your bike. So I always suggest making sure, of course, there's if it doesn't come with an owner's manual, it's nice to have one. Newer bikes would, older bikes, sometimes it gets passed along, sometimes it doesn't. But to have that owner's manual and even have a shop manual is a great way to start, because you can learn how to do some of the things on your bike where you don't necessarily have to take it to the shop all the time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information in most of the owner's manuals about operating the thing and what you might be thinking of. And there's even some kind of safety tips about how to ride and how to check your bike out before the ride and that sort of thing. One thing that would be really important when you're trying to find comfort on a bike is to get a mentor. Somebody
Mhm.
who's already been there can tell you what to look for, what kinds of things make you look more or less comfortable,
Mhm.
things you can change.
Right.
Because a lot of adjustment, we get a lot of bikes in the shop where they're not adjusted to a rider's preference. The levers are in the wrong place, the bars are uncomfortable, maybe the cables are routed badly. They just aren't comfortable to operate. And that is a lot of whether or not you're safe on the bike or you pick the right one.
Right.
And I think when we get them in and we make some changes to make them a bit more friendly, the riders that have less experience are more encouraged by that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think you got to think about that.
Another tip I can talk about, and this isn't really great advertisement for the shop, but we do get a lot of bikes in where someone bought it and got a great deal, but then but then it needs carbs, it needs brakes, it needs, all that stuff, when they could have probably found one for about the same money or less, already running and riding and ready to go.
Yeah.
On the other hand, once that all is done, they kind of know what they have. So that's another talking point as well.
Yeah, and that kind of dovetails into the idea of a vintage bike for me, because if you're going to buy a vintage bike and you don't have good guidance from others, you need to figure out what the relationship is between what you want to accomplish with that bike and whether or not you're prepared to spend the money. One of the things that I've seen over and over and over again today as I was doing some research was forget economics when you're buying a vintage bike. That's kind of an important starting point right there. If you think you're buying it as an investment, you really need to know a lot about the marketplace. You really need to know a lot about the specific bike you're considering if you're considering it as an investment. And if you get some idea of what you're buying from someone who's knowledgeable before you do it, then you won't be surprised by the cost of the potential straightening it out and getting it rideable and making it reliable. And even then, with most vintage bikes, because of their age, their reliability isn't consistent with what you might expect if you don't already have that experience.
Right. And I saw Jenna West actually chime in up there. Let's go back up there. Yeah, she was talking about the seat height. And of course, she's not super short.
No, I would say.
But she's riding some taller bikes now from being experienced.
Yeah, and I'd also say that, Jenna has had her experiences off-road way in advance of most riders, and she's ridden a lot on the road too. So for her to decide that she needs that ground clearance and manageability for an ADV type bike is because of the nature of where she enjoys riding. But she learned it too. I'm sure she'd be the first one to say that what she learned from people that were already doing it at some high level helped her to get better at it quicker.
Yeah, and her story is a good example of she kind of started with a vintage bike and realized that she wanted to ride a little more than she wanted to work on them. And so
I think that speaks for most people. I don't think Jen's unusual.
That speaks for most people, but I think once she kind of got into and she was kind of evolving in the Moto experience and really gravitated to the adventure bikes.
Yeah, but
which
I think
are pretty.
Jen is probably as good an example of an overall rider as anybody I know, because she is bitten by the vintage bug. She has a romantic view of what it is she gets from the motorcycle. I think she gets. I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit, make a presumption on Jenna's part, but when she looks at a 450 Honda, it's not the same eyes she looks at a YZ 250 Yamaha. And it's because she's already predisposed to like it. And I think she's made a good choice for a lot of reasons why that's a good choice for a vintage bike. But I think her attraction to motorcycling is so broad that she's gone way beyond what most people do, whether they like their vintage bike and spend time on it. She had off-road aspirations and followed them to the degree that she's gotten a lot of competence doing it, which is not unlike the rest of us.
Right. Yep. What else here? We've got getting the training course, getting into a training course. I had this kind of toward the end of the show here. We can still talk for a few minutes, but if you want to learn some safety about your motorcycle or just about motorcycle riding in general, like looking where you're going and not getting your eyes fixed on something, you definitely need to get some type of training course and learn from You trying to? Yeah, I've got the camera in the way of the comments there. You want to get into a training course or like you were talking, have someone that really knows how to ride, kind of teach you the ropes, and then you can get out and follow. That's how I learned how to ride motocross after riding woods for quite a long time. I got out there with Keith Carlson, and he's like, well, you need to try the motocross track. And I'm like, okay. So I got out there on my XR 250 and, and I'm casing and into the jumps, and there's no suspension and all that. But once I realized that I needed to follow him and his speed and how he cornered and all that, I started learning really quickly how to ride a little more properly.
Yes,
now I'm faster than Spencer Carlson.
Or so you say. I'm seeing a note here from one of the participants today saying that they'd like to have Jenna on the show. We'd like to have Jenna on the show as well, because she's a great ambassador for the whole sport. I mean, she can talk to people about what her experiences have been, whether it's vintage related, whether it's, being another part of motorcycling that, and frankly, some of us don't get to do. And
yeah, there are a lot more female riders out there, more than ever, I think. And Lisa Gilbreth is another example of a really hardcore female rider who puts more miles on than many of us all combined every year. She's a medical
professional, but she's been through a lot of very high-end bikes in a very short period of time.
Right.
And she puts on 70, 80,000 miles in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, not very many of us ride that much, but she's the serious thing.
And we'll get some people like that on the show. I want to get Rick Smits on the show.
Yeah, we'd like to get Rick Smits on the show.
We need a taller table, but I'd like to get him on here and talk about his passion in the old dirt bikes and Euro dirt bikes and the Makos. And
he's got what I would call a very esoteric taste. And not only does he have esoteric taste, but he really knows it backward and forward. He does his own restorations. He comes in, gets dirty. He asks for guidance when he needs it, but he doesn't need it very often. He's terrific at what he does, and it has nothing to do with basketball. He could have been successful doing just that.
Right. Yeah. How many of you out there are new riders, like within the last year? Pop something up in the comments there. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask us, feel free to do that too, as we get ready to wind up. Brian Graney up in Chicago. Yeah. He's been doing a lot of motocrossing. I know that he raced BMX, I think. He brought a CB750 down to us that his dad had. Remember the Pink Panther bike?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. And so, glad to have you joining in. Appreciate that.
Rick, you all would have had to see the Pink Panther bike to really get it, but it was painted in a Pink Panther theme.
Pull up a picture
with some modifications.
We'll have to do a show just on CB750s, and we'll pull up some of those.
And it was a legacy bike. We get a lot of that where somebody comes in, they're bringing their dad's bike or their grandpa's bike, and they want it treated with respect. We've had people come in, the guy with the compacts, the Sears compacts, he brought like 5 of them at different times and wanted them all to look just like grandpa's.
Yes.
And we did that more than once.
Yes.
And it seemed like he was not sensitive to how much he was spending to do that. We always try to be good at making sure people understand that.
Roger Swartout, good to have you on there. Have not ridden much in the last year. Does that count? No.
Not for you, it doesn't.
You are not a new rider. You're not a beginner rider.
No, in fact, you'd be great at providing guidance to other people. I think if there was somebody that I would think would be really good at doing a rider course as an instructor, Roger would probably be one of those people I'd pick.
Yes, he would. He's done it all. He's done the street racing, or not the street racing, the road racing,
done that too.
Street racing, road racing, motocross.
Yeah, he's been scrambles, flat track.
Him and his brothers.
His brother Carl, who was also a great rider as well. Love to see them as part of that.
Is that your daughter chiming in?
That is my daughter chiming in. Maybe we could get her to be a guest on here and tell us all about the experience she had at her training class.
And we need to bring the St. Bernards in.
Yes, they're actually there. And if you put her comment up, you'll see the St. Bernards in the
let me go
icon.
find that.
There she is. And that's Dora and Lucy.
Big old dogs.
My grand dogs.
Grand doggies.
Yeah. I wish we could show the cat.
I know. I that's why I took the picture of the cat rubbing on the mic earlier. Now he's laying over in one of the foam boxes for the board we use here.
And he almost fits
Well, I'll tell
in.
you what. Let's wrap this show up. Here last week we had a safety tip. It was about pre-tripping your bike, double checking everything on your bike before you go out on the road, and then when you get back, you're supposed to look at it again. Our next safety tip actually for today is gear up. Now, obviously, you're free to ride however you want. There's no helmet laws or anything like that. But we encourage you to gear up. It's just a safe way to ride again. And you may be an amazing rider and can get yourself out of anything, but sometimes we're not in control of the other crazy texters out there, right?
No, that's true. And one thing you want to make sure you do as it relates to gear is make sure you get a helmet that absolutely fits you. And there's a lot of different information sources to tell you how to do that. But basically, if you put a helmet on your head without strapping it down, you should be able to shake your head and the helmet doesn't move around on your head. I know sometimes it's uncomfortable up against your face, but you got to get used to that because it helps keep the helmet in place.
I don't like it squashing my face very much.
I know you don't, but there are people that
all the blood gets pushed out of your head.
You can adjust the cheek pads and make it fit a little better, but make sure you get one that fits. But also, the second thing that I would say is just as important is boots. Boots are important because you're going to be more sure on your controls. You're going to have less issues of something. And this has happened to me many times, especially riding on the street, where some unexpected thing comes up off the road and hits you in the foot or the lower leg. I've had hubcaps, I've had car parts, I've had boxes,
bugs, birds,
anything. And it really disrupts your attention. So having a set of street boots is really important if you're going to ride on the road. You're going to ride off-road, it's even more important because it'll give you some structure that prevents you from getting hurt if you encounter rocks and logs. And
after 9 years, I finally got another set of motocross boots.
And everybody should have some.
Yep.
And gloves are important, but even if you, either way you ride, it's almost essential off-road. It's not as essential on-road, but make sure you get a good set that fit you well, that you use only for motorcycling. That way you won't misplace them and do something else with it.
And a regular just set of work gloves from Lowe's isn't necessarily going to protect you. It's going to eat right through that. So a good set of motorcycle gloves is, spend a little bit of money on your protective gear.
Yeah. I mean, there's some cold weather gloves that are really good for bikes. There's some, I've just bought some last year that are North Face. They're Thinsulate. They're very thin on your hands, but if you get them to fit right, they work really well because they've got rubberized palms and they've got touch screen capable fingertips. And those are about $50 and they're worth the money.
Yes. Ashley Enlow, no flip-flops.
Yeah.
Not too smart.
Unless you're in your pajamas, according to Ron Mahoy.
Right. All right. Well, hey, that wraps up this week's Moto Talk with Steve and Kim. Thanks for joining in. Hopefully you liked it. Leave some comments, some feedback in the comments, and we'll go back and read through those, and we'll see what we come up with for next week. All right. Until then, we'll see you and safe riding.
So long.